the subsidiaries.
Okay.
In this case, the SAT, because SA Group was the policy body, so to speak. And the SAT as a subsidiary had to make sure that its policies were aligned to the group as opposed to operating independently, which then brings to me the issue about the independence bit that was actually making me uncomfortable. But during that time, the chief procurement officer had been charged, and then he resigned before.
That is charged in a disciplinary sense, not in a criminal sense.
Sorry, Chair?
He was charged with disciplinary charges that you are talking about. Not criminal charges.
Not criminal charges.
Yeah.
These were charges relating to the procurement policies.
Yes.
There was a disagreement there between the then chair, Dumieni, and himself. But what I wanted to say is that it was actually clear in my mind that the procurement processes were being eroded in a way, so there's a complete, not a complete breakdown, but it was a breakdown in compliance. But secondly, talking to SAT specifically, there were one or two transactions where I believed that the board could have applied its mind better and interrogate some of the processes and the awarding of their tender. But because we had only two independent, or an executive and perceived to be independent, I believe that there was not much of application of mind in making certain decisions because of lack of vigorous debate. But also, I must also state that going back to the issue about the integrity and the ethics, because these things cannot be legislated, it's something that you feel in your gut or the voice that talks to you between your ears. My gut was just telling me that fundamentally there's something wrong without having to point out specifically to an activity or wrongdoing. But it just was not sitting well with me. My gut was telling me that there was just something wrong as far as corporate governance is concerned, and more specifically, the procurement processes and the decisions that were being made. So, Chair, it's quite difficult for me at this stage to make specific examples. But that's how I felt at that point in time.
Yes, okay, thank you.
On that point, Mr. Piri, was there any interference in the procurement at SAA Technical?
As I said, Chair, I think that would possibly require me to be a bit more specific, because otherwise I don't want to generalize specific instances.
Yes.
If it need be, then I think it would be a matter of a different testimony.
I understand you to want to limit your your evidence in regard to the issues of procurement and ethics and so on at that time, to saying certain things were happening which made you believe that ethics was being eroded and that there were challenges with regard to procurement, following procurement processes, but you want to leave it at that. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Yes, okay.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Piri, so when did you resign from SAA Technical?
I resigned in May for the reason that I've actually stated. And a week later, I did get a call from the chairlady, who was then Yake Kwinana, to say that my departure had left a vacuum. And given the fact that SA Technical is a highly regulated institution, and compliance was the key. So without a CEO, it does question the license of the organization. So she asked me to go back at least for a month or two in order to close the gap. The thinking was that within that time, they would have secured the services of a substantive CEO. In fact, I mean, at that stage, the CEO of SAT, before I got the acting role, was Musazwane, who was then asked to act at the SA Group. And I basically took over his CEO role at the SA Technical. So at the time when Yake Kwinana was asking me to go back for 2 months, at that point in time, the thinking was that they would have been able to finalize the recruitment of a group exco, in which case then Musazwane would then go back to his old role of CEO Technical. So I agreed after careful consideration, and I was there for 1.5 months, and I left end of August. And during that time, when I went back, it's a time when Yake Kwinana resigned as a board member, who kindly had shared with me why he had resigned. And one of the issues that she had raised was that the corporate governance issues are being compromised. So she decided to leave, which meant that there are only 2 board members left, which is below the threshold as required by PFMA. But subsequent to that, there was an appointment of additional board members. But for me, I think the second departure was informed by the fact that even our chair lady had to resign, citing the very same issues that were making me uncomfortable, which basically confirmed my gut and the voice that was talking to me. So that for me was an indication that indeed what I thought was my gut feeling is actually real.
Who was the chair lady that you are talking about now?
Sorry?
Who was the chair lady that you are talking about? I think you said the chair lady resigned. Is that right?
Yeah, Mrs. Yake Kwinana.
Oh, she was the chair lady?
She was the chair lady.
Oh, okay, all right.
Of SA Technical.
Yes. Earlier on, Ms. September asked you specific instances of challenges with procurement.
Yeah.
And I understood you to say you wanted to leave it at simply saying it was your feeling or perception that there were issues in regard to procurement challenges and ethics. I just want to say that it's not because we are not interested in instances of challenges on procurement and so on, but it's simply because I've read your statement. I know that it doesn't cover those issues, and certainly subsequent to this, if the legal team talks to you and it appears that you do have knowledge of instances relating to procurement that may be important for the Commission, then they can take a statement that covers those issues. Okay. I don't want anybody to think we are not interested in issues of procurement that you might know about.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
As it pleases, Chair. So you left the organization or rather SAA Technical in September of 2016, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that at that particular time, you took the decision to retire, you then ventured out of the aviation industry, but you returned to the aviation industry on the 21st of November 2018. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Can you just clarify? In fact, sorry. Is it correct then that you joined SA Express on the 21st of November 2018?
That's correct, Chair. As I said, that I took a break. I call it semi-retirement. And around about August, September, I was offered a job at the S Express, as the general manager for commercial, basically my old job at the SA Express.
Is that August, September of 2018?
It's 21st of September 2018 for a one-year contract that expires on the 20th of November this year, 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Piri. So according to my calculations, you have experience of approximately 15 years within the aviation industry. Is my calculation correct?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to say that you are in fact well-versed in contracting arrangements within the aviation industry, based on your experience within the industry?
That's correct, Chair.
So if you can then turn to page 2 of your statement, and paragraph 6 talks specifically to the focus of your evidence today, which we'll now focus on. You have been requested by the Commission to do a comparative analysis between suites of agreements. And as outlined on page 2, paragraph 6, please just describe the core point of focus for your evidence today.
Thank you, Chair. The whole purpose of today is to look at the contract that or arrangement that the S Express had entered with the Dubai Trade Port. The Dubai Trade Port being a Schedule 3C of the PFMA. Schedule 3 government entities basically have got dual mandates. The one is a commercial mandate, the other is a developmental mandate. In terms of the commercial mandate, is that these entities are expected to be profitable and sustainable, but with focus on economic growth, as well as spurring employment as well. And the Dubai Trade Port was such entity. This was enacted by I was just about to say Northwest, by the KwaZulu-Natal provincial government as part of the Department of Economic Development. The objective of forming this Dubai Trade Port was specifically to look at the creation of an electropolis within KwaZulu-Natal province. In this case, it was in Durban specifically. And the focus was going to be logistics, whether it's by air or by sea. But over and above that, they're also looking at the possibility of developing it into an investment zone, a special economic zone, which would ideally attract investments of various nature.
Okay. So on the one hand, you looked at a contractual suite of agreements relating to transactions between SA Express and Dubai Trade Port, is that right?
Yes.
And then as compared to that, you've also looked at another suite of agreements which has been provided to you by the investigators of this commission. We talk specifically to the transactions between the Northwest Department of Transport and SA Express. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
The common denominator, or at least the primary common denominators of these two suites of agreements, is that SA Express is a common contracting party. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
And that both these suites of agreements relate to the development of new routes.
That's correct, Chair.
In particular, the Dubai Trade Port suite of agreements, if we could call it that, talks to the development of routes between King Shaka International Airport, Durban, and Lusaka on the one hand, and Harare on the other.
That's correct, Chair.
Whereas the Northwest suite of agreements talks to the development of new routes in relation to the Pilanesberg and the Mafeking airports relative to other airports?
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. Were you personally involved in or rather, let me first ask you, how did South African Express become involved in the Dubai Trade Port project?
Chair, as part of my responsibility as the General Manager for Regional Expansion, was to look at opportunities within the SADC region, with a view not only to provide air transport to passengers, to fly from Southern Africa destination to South Africa, but to also ensure that we promote trade. But we would do so responsibly, and I will explain possibly as I go along in my testimony why I'm talking about the sustainability. Now, in 2010, 2011, we were approached by the Dubai Trade Port to basically request or encourage S Express to set up a hub out of Durban as a part of the Dubai Trade Port objectives in driving economic growth and therefore employment in the province, with a view that the S Express would then operate into key destinations in Southern Africa, of which Lusaka in Zambia and the Harare in Zimbabwe were on the top 5 on the list of opportunities. This arose from a study that was done by Subsidy Consulting. At that point in time, they were contracted to Dubai Trade Port. So they had done a whole analysis in terms of opportunities in Southern Africa, and they were actually prioritized accordingly. The approach was timely in the sense that it was at the time when the S Express was indeed desiring to expand into the rest of the continent. So the ideas definitely dovetailed. S Express then responded positively, but obviously in air business, when you are starting a new route, you tend to make losses in the first 1 or 2 years, which in general terms we call it an investment in order for you to operate on those routes. So it takes that long to get to a point where you are profitable on those new routes. Now, it was actually clear to us that for the routes that were earmarked by Subsidy out of Durban, it could actually take longer to actually do so. So Dubai Trade Port came up with an incentive program to encourage airlines to operate out of the hub. And these incentives came in the form of subsidies.
And so if I may then, following on from your evidence, another very critical common denominator between the agreements in the Dubai Trade Port precinct and the agreements in the Northwest precinct is that both suites of agreements concerned some form of compensation or incentivization payable to South African Express. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. Who owns the King Shaka International Airport?
AXA owns and manages King Shaka Airport, Chair.
So notwithstanding that the contracts we are now going to interrogate was concluded with Dubai Trade Port, was AXA involved in these negotiations at all?
Not at all, Chair.
Were you involved in the negotiations with Dubai Trade Port?
I was actively involved in the negotiations, culminating to the signing of the MOU and the subsequently signing of the MOA, Memorandum of Agreement.
And so your involvement ended after the memorandum of agreement that was concluded between Dubai Trade Port and South African Express?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Your involvement ended after the memorandum of agreement was concluded.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. Now, in order,
The involvement that ended would be involvement in what?
The negotiations and the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, and the signing of the Memorandum of Agreement. That was the extent of my involvement, because the MOA was signed in 2012, in the very same year that I had left for SA Technical.
So does it mean that after the signing of the Memorandum of Agreement, you had no particular interactions with the Dubai Trade Port?
No, not at all, Chair.
You did not, or you did? You had no involvement whatsoever, or you still had some other involvement with them?
No, had no any other involvement, especially in light of the fact, Chair,
Yes.
that the Memorandum of Agreement had made provision that the two sets of agreements would provide the general framework.
Okay.
And that at any given point in time, should a route be identified for execution, there should be a separate addendum that talks to a specific route that has to be executed. So I provided and signed for the general framework.
Okay.
But the actual execution was going to be in accordance with an addendum which was to still be concluded by both parties. So I left at the stage where the framework was agreed
been put in place.
and signed for.
Okay.
And I had no further involvement in terms of the actual execution.
Okay, and I think that's what I was looking for, whether in regard to execution, you had no involvement. That's fine.
That's correct, Chair.
and the reason for you then not being involved any longer, to follow on from your evidence earlier, is that at the time that, or shortly after the MOA was in fact signed, you left SA Express during 2012. Is that right?
That's correct. When both MOU and the MOA were signed, that's when I left.
Okay. So, in order to do what I could possibly call an apple with apple comparative analysis, let's just consolidate what exactly the type of agreements were that constituted what we could call the Dubai Trade Port Agreements as compared to the Northwest Agreements. Is it right that the Dubai Trade Port Agreements consists of a series of agreements, such being the Memorandum of Understanding, the Memorandum of Agreement, and certain addenda?
That's correct, Chair.
And parking that to one side, if one were to then consider the agreements concluded in the Northwest, you would look at or rather you have considered the main agreement that was concluded between the Northwest Department of Transport and South African Express, together with 4 ground handling contracts. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So to do the comparative analysis, can I ask you first to turn to page 23, please?
23.
Is this the Memorandum of Understanding that was part of the evidence you've just given?
That's correct, Chair.
And this Memorandum of Understanding was concluded between Dubai Trade Port and South African Express Airways.
That's correct, Chair.
Can I ask you then to turn to page 26? Oops,
26?
sorry, to 35. Humble apologies. Is it correct that this agreement was signed then on during September of 2011?
That's correct.
Whose signature appears on behalf of South African Express?
It's my signature.
Thank you. And now to just look at some of the key provisions.
I'm sorry, are you looking at the signatures at page 35?
Page 35, Chair.
Yes. Excuse me. Is SAX, does SAX stand for South African Express? Does SAX stand for South African Express?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes, Chair.
so that is your signature there.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Paragraph 1.1.2 on page 25 defines SAX to mean the SA Express. I ought to have taken you there, Chair. Sorry. If we can then turn to page 26. And paragraph 3 specifically talks to the duration of the agreement. And 3.1.1 informs that the agreement would then be terminated, or rather 3.1.1 read together with the balance of subparagraphs, informs that the agreement would terminate by this agreement being by being replaced by more substantive agreements, by mutual agreement to not proceed, or after 12 months from signature date.
That's correct, Chair.
And it is therefore correct that there was in fact a subsequent agreement that was signed, which was the memorandum of agreement that you were also involved in.
That's correct, Chair.
If I can then ask you to turn to page 25. Paragraph 2.3 sets out the scope of this agreement, and in particular, it reads, with your leave, Chair, that the parties have agreed to cooperate with one another to develop potential partnerships for their mutual benefit and in order to develop strategic partnerships for. To name but 3 of them, 2.3.1 informs regional route development from King Shaka International Airport. Subparagraph 2.3.2 talks about the formation of a joint marketing plan and the joint implementation of that marketing plan for areas of common interest. If we turn the page, subparagraph 2.3.5 also talks to the repair, overhaul, and maintenance of the SA Express aircraft and air fleet at King Shaka International Airport. If I can then ask you to turn to page 28, please. At paragraph 5.2, the parties also agree that the Dubai Trade Port will provide marketing support for a period of 1 year in respect of each of the routes referred to in Annexure A. And Annexure A can be found on page 36 of the bundle.
Did you say 36?
36, Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Piri, the routes that are identified at page 36, which 2 routes did SA Express show a particular interest in?
SA Express Chair showed interest on the Zambia and the Zimbabwe. So it was the country number 1 and the country number 8 in the table.
Thank you. And then in line with your evidence of earlier, which spoke about incentivization offerings, can I ask you to turn to page 30, please? 3-0. Paragraph 11 talks particularly to the Preliminary Activities Fund. 11.1 speaks specifically to the fact that Dubai Trade Port will advance an amount of 5 million rand to be utilized for the planning, development, marketing, and operations of the joint activities contemplated by the Memorandum of Understanding to be split between passenger and cargo activities. Can you just explain in a little bit more detail exactly what this Preliminary Activities Fund was and how was it contemplated at the time to operate?
Chair, at the time, the thinking was that due to the fact that it takes a bit of time to develop a route, the incentive therefore from Dubai Trade Port was that they would actually assist us or assist S Express in ensuring that the route was actually a success. And in that regard, they had formulated what they called incentives. And these incentives came in a form of rebates. But the rebates were defined in two ways. One was the market development. The other was the assistance in the operational costs. Now, in terms of the marketing costs, it was clearly defined that these would be the costs that would be incurred by S Express prior to the commencement of the route. Ordinarily in the aviation industry, that before your first flight, you need to secure an opening of the flight in a system, if I can put it that way. You open a flight in a system and allow it time to sail. And that ordinarily would be, for regional routes, would be about 3 months. So you open a flight in a system, you go out to the market, sell it, and of course passengers would book on it with a view to fly in 3 months' time. And you continue that exercise until your first flight. The reason of doing that is that we always want to ensure that your first flight is a success. Otherwise, if you only allow a few days, then you'll be heading for a disaster on your first flight. So Dubai Trade Port was happy to assist with those costs of marketing. But also over and above that, they are also happy to incentivize S Express by ensuring that they are giving us a rebate on the operating costs. But bear in mind that those were only applicable for a period of 1 year, save for this 3 months period before we start a flight. But the way it was structured was that the S Express as an airline was to incur these costs and then claim from Dubai Trade Port.
Before we talk about the incurring and claiming methodologies, which is neatly captured in the Memorandum of Agreement, can we perhaps then go there just to set the context for what you are about to inform?
Well, let me just get the last point that you were making. You were saying that SA Express would incur certain costs and claim those costs from Dubai Trade Port, and those costs would be covered under the Preliminary Activities Fund. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. So, Chair, the extent of the claim was estimated to be around 5 million for both the route development as well as operations. So it was capped at the 5 million.
Okay.
Can I then ask you to please turn to page 38 of the bundle, 38. Is that the Memorandum of Agreement concluded between Dubai Trade Port and South African Express Airways following the Memorandum of Understanding?
That's correct, Chair.
Can I ask you to please turn to page 52 of the bundle? Noting from this page that this agreement was signed during May of 2012, whose signature appears on this page on behalf of South African Express?
It's my signature, Chair.
Thank you. On page 43 of the agreement, 43 of the bundle, mention is made that this agreement is concluded for 12 months at paragraph 4, and in particular to the information that you were sharing with the Chair on the entitlements to claim and claim methodology. I'd like us to look at clause 5. So clause 5 talks specifically to the regional route development. And can I ask you to read into the record clause 5.2, please?
Thank you, Chair. Paragraph 5.2 on page 43 of the bundle. I quote, for a period of 12 months after signature date and in respect of routes identified in Annexure A, which we have actually looked at, DTP will contribute, DTP meaning Dube Tradeport, will contribute to SA Express navigation costs for aircraft flying into King Shaka International Airport on each route, and also for the landing charges, parking costs, and the aircraft handling charges incurred by S Express, aircraft operating the routes specified in Annexure A. Again, DTP's contribution will take the form of financial rebates per specified aircraft flying the specified routes, and it will be limited to the actual costs referred to above for each aircraft landing at King Shaka International Airport, calculated in accordance with the clause 5.3b of the agreement below, and it then states what those would be.
And if I could then ask you to turn to page 44. In continuance of clause 5.3, paragraph 5.3b, 1, 2, and 3 outlines very clear, defined amounts that are claimable in respect of particular types of aircraft. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Then could I ask you to read paragraph 5.4 into the record, please?
5.4, Chair, clarifies how these claims would be made and for which specific items. Dube Tradeport and S Express will conclude addenda to this agreement to provide for each of the individual routes identified in Annexure A prior to commencement of the operation of those routes by S Express. Each addendum will stipulate the actual rebate to be paid by Dube Tradeport, and it will be calculated in accordance with the clause 5.3b above. The rebates set out in clause 5.3b above are based on 2012 regulated tariffs applied by AXA and the ATNS. At this point in time, Chair, I just wanted to clarify because it talks about the AXA and the ATNS. But these costs basically relate to the landing and parking for AXA, and then the navigation specifically speaks to ATNS. And these rates are regulated, gazetted rates. So the thinking then was that S Express would pay these rates for landing, parking, and the navigation in accordance with the gazetted rates. And then on invoice, they would then claim. I just wanted to clarify that when they talk about the ADNS and the AXA. And it continues to say that and such rebates will apply, provided that in the event that these amounts are lawfully increased by AXA and the ADNS during the applicable period, the parties will provide for the permitted increases to the regulated tariffs in each addendum. So it makes it very clear that in the event that there is an increase in terms of the tariffs during the period where these rebates are applicable, then there would be adjustment. So in other words, Dube Trade Port would have the opportunity to validate the amount that the S Express is claiming, not only from the invoice, but also checking it against the regulated tariff. So there was a double control from that point of view.
Then in summary, the methodology of how this agreement applied to the incentivization of the scheme, based on the paragraphs that you read, includes that SA Express is entitled to claim a specific amount, which is calculated per aircraft. That amount is regulated by tariffs, which applies to both AXA, for the record being Airports Company of South Africa, and AT&S being Air Traffic Navigation Services.
That's correct.
In addition, the claim methodology is that SA Express pays and then claims back based on a checks and balances process.
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Piri, while some of these terms are quite familiar to you, can I ask that we unpack some of these terms a bit so that it's going to be used further in your evidence as well? Paragraph 5.2 on page 43 talks about a whole range of charges and costs and the like. You mentioned also earlier about operating costs. Can you please explain what exactly operating costs would include for an airline on a route?
Chair, as an airline, in order to discharge its responsibility of flying passengers from one point to another point, and also cargo from one point to another point, you would need an aircraft, first of all. You would need crew, both cockpit and the cabin crew. And of course, you need fuel. You'd need to ensure that the meals are provided on board. And you have to ensure that the aircraft is clean. In other words, the product that you're offering the passengers is in good shape. So part of the operating costs have to do with the provision of the aircraft. But over and above that, you do also have to incur costs in terms of distribution of your inventory, which is the sale of the seats or space in terms of cargo, and also the services that are rendered to passengers as they board the aircraft. So in other words, I'm looking at having access to the airport, because that, in the case of Dube Trade Port or Durban, it's the AXA-owned King Shaka Airport, and they provide certain services, of which they also charge for those services. But also over and above that, we have what we call ground services. Now, ground services ordinarily would include passenger services, which is when you walk to the airport. For those of you who have flown, would understand that when you walk into the airport, the first thing that you do, you go straight to a check-in counter. That's a service for the passengers. And sometimes you walk in and you'd like to change your flight, so you go to a passenger service desk, where you can change your flight or book a new flight, whatever the case may be. And of course, after you have checked in, you walk through the security and you go inside and then you check out. But in terms of ground handling services, I think that's when it really starts to kick in, because as a passenger, you have to get into a bus and you have to get to the aircraft. And there are also certain services that are rendered to the aircraft. For example, the fueling of the aircraft, the cleaning of the aircraft, and providing the necessary equipment to allow safe boarding of passengers. So all those services are categorized as the ground handling services. And there's a cost attached to it. So over and above the cost of the aircraft, you have to add all these costs, and they would normally classify them as the operating costs. But basically, it's a cost of operating an aircraft.
Thank you. If I could then ask you to...
I didn't say when we would take the tea break, since we started earlier than normal. We'll take it at 9:30. Just in case there may be people attending who might not be aware, we are not going to sit the whole day today. We will adjourn at 11. And then tomorrow we will not start at normal time. We hope to start around 12 o'clock. So just so that people can plan their lives appropriately. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Pursuant to the Memorandum of Agreement, it was mentioned in there that certain more substantive agreements need to be concluded in respect of each route, and those were in fact concluded. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Can I ask you to turn to page 55, please, of the bundle? '55 appears to be the addendum which was concluded in respect of the Kinshasa-Lusaka route. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. And just to focus then on the particular costings which form part of the incentivization scheme. If I could ask you to turn to page 56. Clause 4, 4.1, which specifically deals with preliminary activity costs that were contemplated in the previous memoranda. Dube Trade Port will contribute to the preliminary activity costs for the launch of the route to a maximum of 500,000 rand. And that is as compared to the 5 million rand originally contemplated in the memoranda. Is that right?
That's correct. But Chair, I must also emphasize that the 500,000 is just part of the 5 million that was contemplated in the memorandum of agreement, bearing in mind that the 5 million was for both the marketing as well as the rebates on the operations. Okay. So those two items were actually separated. So this is specifically talking to the marketing part of it.
Okay, all right. I suspect that at certain stages your voice goes down. It may be that some of the people at the back might not hear you when it goes down.
Yeah.
Try and maintain it at the higher level.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, I note that we are on 1 minute to past. May it be convenient?
Yeah, let's take the tea break and we'll resume at 10:15.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn. Yes, let's proceed.
Mr. Piri, we were talking about the addendum that starts on page 55 in relation to the King Shaka and Lusaka route. Just on that score, to follow up on the evidence that you gave earlier, you were no longer at SA Express at the time that these addenda were then concluded. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
And when you departed, who did you hand the Dubai Trade Port project over to?
It was handed over, Chair, to Mr. Brian van Veek.
And which role did he take?
At that point, Brian van Veek was a general manager, commercial.
Thank you. If I could then ask you to turn to page 58, which is the signature page of this particular addendum, whose name appears for and on behalf of South African Express, having signed on the 22nd of November 2012.
Chair, it's Mr. Brian van Veek.
In particular, it's noted GM Commercial below that. Is that right?
That's right, Chair.
If we could then resume where we had left off before the short adjournment, and that's on page 56. For the record, paragraph 4.2 specifically talks to the preliminary activity costs will be drawn from the preliminary activities fund and will be utilized for route launch and marketing activities in advance of the commencement of the operation of the route. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
And then paragraph, sorry, I keep on referring to them as paragraphs, clauses. Clause 5 on page 57 speaks specifically to flight incentive costs.
Sorry, can you repeat that, Chair?
Page 57, clause 5, talks to the flight incentive costs that were offered in respect of this route.
That's correct, Chair.
Having considered the detail, and particularly having been looked at the comparative analysis between these agreements and the Northwest agreements, it is recorded here that the ratings, the charges, and the tariffs for the entitlements to claim are similar to as outlined in the memoranda. But we can look at that on page 59 and 60, which details the charges that they were entitled to claim.
Your sentence is not complete. Your question is not complete.
Okay.
You started it and then
Apologies.
I think you changed your mind about what to say in midway. So just ask the question again. It's not complete.
Humble apologies, Chair. Paragraph 5 outlines the flight incentive costs. That's on page 57.
That's correct.
Having considered this particular clause, does it accord with the agreement set out in the memorandum of agreement in relation to flight incentive costs, the payment of it, and the calculation of it?
Yes, it does agree, Chair.
In that regard, can we then turn to page 59? Where at Annexure A, it sets out the costing schedule. Part B talks to the flight incentive costs. And on the next page, they give the detail of costs. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Can you clarify exactly what the amount of 14,079.11 means in the context of this particular addendum? That sum is the cost per trip as found on page 59 of the bundle.
Page 59, as making reference to the flight incentive costs.
Yes. So page 59, part B talks to flight incentive costs. There's a rebate in relation to a CRJ 200
Yep.
aircraft, and the cost per trip is 14,079.11. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And if you then turn the page to page 60, you will see that that cost accords with the total reflected at the bottom of that page.
That's correct, Chair.
And how that amount is calculated is outlined in the table on page 60. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Now, when you look at the detail of these different types of costings, in the center of the page is called ground handling,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
For purposes of the record, can you just clarify exactly which costs listed in here would all form part of ground handling?
Okay. Thank you. As I had indicated earlier, that the ground handling is normally used as a generic term in its totality, meaning that it's all the services that are offered from passenger check-in all the way to when the aircraft is actually boarding. Now, ordinarily, the passenger services are rendered by the airline that's operating, but in some instances, the airlines may opt to use other service providers to do the passenger handling. So sometimes that's why, again, for those people who have flown, sometimes you're flying on SAA, but you see that the check-in agents have got nothing to do with SAA. It's possibly British Airways, for example, or the service provider that's been appointed by the airport company. So that service could be done by either the airline or a third party. Now, if you move the passenger all the way to the ground, where you basically are walking from the boarding gate, the services that are offered from then on to the aircraft are also done by third parties. But I must also explain that I think which you would possibly touch on as we go through the testimony, that the service providers for ground handling for airports or AXA managed airports are licensed by AXA. And these service providers have to be compliant with what we call IATA, which is an International Aviation Transport Association. And they also have to be compliant with the ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization. This is a regulatory body. So AXA has a responsibility of identifying these service providers who then get licensed in as long as they are compliant with the IATA standards and the ICAO standards. Now, airlines ordinarily would only confine the selection of a service provider from this suite of service providers who are licensed by, in this case, AXA. So you are confined to those service providers. And these are the service providers that offer the ground handling services. But as I said, that is sometimes the word ground handling can be confusing because the scope can be expanded and it can be shrunk. So the true services that are offered under ground handling agreement are defined in specific agreements because the scope can be widened and it can be shortened in as long as the minimum services are being offered. And you have what we call the standard IATA ground handling agreement. It's a template that we use, but you vary it depending on the scope of the services that you're contracting to. So these ground handling services, although they've got an expanded scope, they have to be defined in the actual contract. What is it that you're paying for, and what are the rates And then based on that, you have your service level agreement with the service provider. But as I said, that this service provider have to be IATA and ICAO certified.
And so if you look at page 60, is it correct then that ground handling services would include all the additional ad hoc items listed there, which would be aircraft towing, pushback, passenger assist unit, which is for the acronym PAU, wheelchair first bus, second bus, air starter unit, and ground power unit, which is for the acronym GPU?
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you.
Would it be correct to simply say that ground handling, really, that business, that part of the business, relates to everything that needs to be done on the ground before and up to the time when the passenger and his or her luggage get onto the aircraft, and after the passenger leaves the aircraft up to when she leaves the airport building? That is what all the activities connected with the traveling of a passenger who is flying or who has been flying, all that happens to enable her or him to fly, that happens on the ground up to the time when he or she gets onto the plane and his or her luggage gets onto the plane, and when he or she has landed on the other end, her leaving the aircraft, going to the airport building, being able to collect his or her luggage. That's all ground handling.
Chair, I didn't understand your last bit. I understood your first bit about
Yes,
how you define.
the second bit is when you leave the aircraft at your destination, you leave the aircraft from that point and your luggage being taken out of the aircraft up to the time you get out of the airport building. Whatever activities need to be done to enable you to leave the airport building, that's part of aircraft ground handling.
Chair, it's actually a very smart way of defining ground services. It's well understood, Chair.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst we've now identified what the flight incentive costs would be, it is recorded in clause 6 on page 57 that payment will be done in arrears. So once again, you have SA Express that incurs the cost and then claims back from Dubai Trade Port. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. If we could then turn to page 63 of the bundle. And this is an addendum which was also concluded in respect of the same route, being King Shaka International Airport and Lusaka route, and it was a follow-up after the first addendum expired. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. If I could ask you to once again just confirm that the payment structure in relation to this addendum was no different to the first addendum that was concluded.
That's correct, Chair.
And if one looks particularly at page 65, paragraph 4.2, clause 4. Is it correct that there's no mention that's made of preliminary activity costs in here?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. And one of the main objects of preliminary costs related to route marketing and development.
That's correct, Chair.
If we can then turn to page 66. For SA Express, do you recognize any signatures that were appended on the 7th of August 2013?
Chair, this was signed by the then CEO of S Express, again, Saks means S Express, Inati Nchanga, and as a witness, it was signed by Brian van Veek and Ms. Thandi Kunene.
So, under witnesses, the first signature is that of Mr. Van Veek, and the second one is that of Ms. Thandi Kunene. Is that what you're saying? Okay, I must raise my voice.
Yes.
I forgot.
Yes, Chair.
The first witness in relation to the signature or signatory of SA Express,
Yes.
is that the signature for Mr. Van Veek, the first signature as a witness?
Yeah, Chair, on the witness side, definitely, that's the signature for Mr. Brian van Veek.
Yes, and the second witness signature, you say, is that of Ms. Thandi Kunene?
Yes, yes, Chair.
Okay, and the signatory, the one who signed for SA Express, you say, that signature is that of Mr. Nchanga?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And then if you turn to page 67, at which Annexure A and the costing schedule is reflected, page 68 once again refers to an itemized cost process. Well, not process, sorry, an itemized claim in respect of different types of costs. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. That then concludes the addenda in relation to the first route. If we could turn then to page 70. It's an addendum which is dated November 2013, and it specifically relates to the King Shaka Harare route, as concluded between Dubai Trade Port and South African Express.
Yes, Chair.
Once again, if I can ask you to turn to page 73. Do you recognize any of the signatures who signed on behalf of SA Express during November of 2013?
I recognize Brian van Veek's signature representing S Express.
Thank you. And then just to place this particular document into context, on page 71,
I'm sorry, before that, do you recognize any of the signatures who witnessed, who signed as witnesses against Mr. Van Veek's signature?
Witness number one is Ms. Thandi Kunene, but
Yes.
I can't recognize
The
witness number
second
two.
one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. To put this particular addendum into context, on page 71, clause 3.1c records that this particular addendum supersedes the first addendum, which we do not have before us. And on page 72, like with the second addendum in respect of the other route, there appears to be a similar process on the flight incentivization costs and the process of claiming. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
In particular, in clause 5.1, once again, it is outlined that the payment methodology is such that SA Express incurs the debt and then claims the amount back from Dubai Trade Port.
That's correct, Chair.
Now, these particular amounts that have been recorded in the annexures to the addenda, would they be contemplated to cover all of the costs for the operation of these routes, or only part of the costs?
Chair, the incentives were classified as rebates, and by their very nature, they did not cover the entire flight costs. It was a partial recovery of those costs, because if you look at the total flat costs or operating costs compared to the rebates. They cover, in our thinking then, about 5 to 10% of the operating costs of an aircraft. So it was in a true sense a rebate, but also it defined how those rebates were going to be paid. So it wasn't done upfront, but it was done in arrears. So in other words, S Express had to prove that those were paid, and in some cases, in terms of the AXA and the ATNS charges, those had to be compared to the tariffs. So there was an external verification that had to be done. And only when those two tests have been passed would Dubai Tradeport then pay the rebate to S Express.
Thank you. Then in summary of these particular agreements, the common thread between the Dubai Tradeport agreements, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that on the one hand you have a preliminary activities fund from which certain costings can be claimed. Is that right?
That's correct.
Part of those claims, which would be a claim entitlement, would be flight incentive costs.
That's correct, Chair.
And these flight incentive costs in particular were cost contributions that were calculated on clear public tariffs.
That's correct, Chair.
Published tariffs. Sorry.
Gazetted.
Published, gazetted tariffs. The claim process for how these claims are to take place are clearly outlined.
That's correct, Chair.
The payment entitlement is payment in arrears.
That's correct, Chair.
And so the flight incentive costs essentially, because of the itemized claims, computes to a maximum amount that may be claimable in relation to a specific type of costs or relative to a specific type of aircraft. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so in so doing, the flight incentive costs are also based on actual flights, and it's also based on qualifying flight costs, as we've dealt with through the different agreements.
That's correct, Chair.
I can then ask you to now turn to page 12 of your affidavit. Paragraph 44 talks about monies that SA Express in fact claimed during the year of 2014. And in particular, it is listed that out of a total of 3,882,984.27 cents, that total includes costs relating to landing, parking, PAX handling, presumably passenger handling, and ramp handling or aircraft handling. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And that was the total sum that was claimed over a 12-month period during 2014.
That's correct, Chair.
Are there any costings there that are excluded from operations costs that may have been claimed?
Chair, there was an element of navigation costs, which was claimable, which is hardly less than 1 million, which means that the figure of 3.8 should actually read 4.8. Bearing in mind that if you go back to the MOA, it does place a limit of how much you can claim in a year, which was 5 million. So the claimable amount was close to the figure of 5 million limit.
So you say that this 3.8 million rand, I'm just rounding it off, you still need to add another 1 million to it. That would be the costs. So they have not taken into account another amount of about R1 million.
That's correct, Chair. And that,
Yes.
that cost element is the navigation.
Yes, okay.
And that total cost then of 4.8 would really constitute a contribution towards the total cost of operation on these particular routes. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay. Having concluded,
I'm sorry, would that be a contribution or would that be all the operational costs that would be claimable from that amount of 5 million?
Chair, you must remember that the cost elements that were claimable
Yes.
were clearly defined in
Yes,
the agreement.
yes,
Now, this claim, in line with the
Falls within the budget for
right.
that. Yes.
And I'm just drawing to your attention that the total that has been claimed
Yes, okay.
is then close to the 5 million that
Yeah.
was provided for
Yes.
in a fund.
Yes.
So the total claimable amount is close to the 5 million
Yeah.
limit that was set
Okay.
by both parties.
thank you, Chair. If I could ask you to turn to page 88 of your bundle. There appears to be some gazetted publications. Are these in fact the rates that you have provided which were relevant for purposes of the rebates during that particular period?
This was just to demonstrate the tariffs or the gazetted tariffs that were utilized in calculating the AXA and the ATNS charges. So I was just providing this to ensure that indeed the claims that were made against the Dube Tradeport were in accordance with the agreement. But in any case, Dube Tradeport was within its right to ensure that before they refund or before they pass on the rebate, that the rates that we are appearing in the invoices are in line with the gazetted tariffs.
Okay. If we can now then turn to the Northwest suite of agreements, which have already been traversed through the evidence of Mr. Ngwenya of yesterday. Based on that evidence, we do not intend to go into particular detail, as has already been addressed yesterday. Could I ask you to turn to page 107, please? Do you recognize this document as you've considered it?
Yes, Chair.
And what is it?
This is what is referred to the main agreement between the Northwest Department of Community Safety and Transport Management, which for the purpose of this agreement is referred to the department, and the South African Express Airways SOC Limited.
Thank you. And it's correct that this agreement was the foundation, or rather the contractual foundation, which reintroduced an air transportation service from OR Tambo International Airport, Cape Town International Airport, Pilanesberg, and Mafeking.
That's correct, Chair.
And in particular, the agreement was concluded on the basis of a subsidy being given by the Northwest government to South African Express.
That's correct, Chair.
Can I ask you to turn to page 144, please?
What page?
144.
Okay.
In line with your signature identifications of earlier, can you please identify who signed this agreement on behalf of SA Express?
Chair, the signatures that appear on this agreement are of the then CEO of S Express, Inati Nchanga.
That's the first signature on the page. Is that the first signature on the page?
Sorry, Chair?
is the signature that you say belongs to Mr. Nchanga, the first one on
Yeah.
this page?
Yes, Chair.
Yeah.
So it's signed for,
I just want you to identify which
I
one
see.
is whose signature and which one is whose signature.
okay, thank you, Chair. The first signature in the first row, where it defines as a signed for on behalf of S Express, is that of Inati Nchanga, who was the CEO at the time of S Express, and then as a witness, it was signed by Brian van Veek. But it seems to me that both signatures are not dated.
Thank you. Noting that Brian
I'm
van...
sorry, both signatures are not?
Dated. There's no date.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Based on the fact that Mr. Brian van Wyk had witnessed this agreement and has also in one or other capacity been involved in the conclusion of the addenda between Dubai Trade Port and South African Express, would
That-
it be fair to understand that Mr. Brian van Wyk was familiar with the agreements, or rather the addenda under the Dubai Trade Port project and this particular agreement?
That's correct, Chair. I must also state, Chair, that these signatures for the three addenda for the Dubai Trade Port /SACS project and on this main agreement, Northwest and the S Express, Brian van Wyk signed them as a general manager for commercial.
Thank you.
Who was the owner, according to your knowledge, of the Pilanesberg and Mafeking airports?
Chair, the Northwest Provincial Government owns the two airports.
Okay. If we can then look at page 14 of the bundle. And just to confirm evidence that was, or rather submissions and evidence that was presented yesterday in relation to the agreement, Chair, this contract was indeed for a period of 5 years, which was from the effective date. And the effective date is reckoned on page 1110 of the bundle to mean 27 March 2015 in respect of certain routes, and 1 May 2015 in respect of the other. And SA Express in particular agreed to operate the two airports using the CRJ 200 aircraft, and in doing so to provide crew, distribution, sales, and airline operational infrastructure. Mr. Piri, when we look at then page 115, to focus in on this contribution of costings in order for us to compare the apples with apples scenario between Dubai Trade Port and the Northwest suites of agreements. So page 115, clause 4.3, talks to that as a contribution towards the cost of SA Express in providing the airline service, the department shall grant to SA Express the subsidy as more fully described in clause 6. And clause 6 in particular is reflected on the next page, on page 116. Clause 6.1 records that the department shall pay to SA Express the subsidy and the management company the operational costs of both airports annually in advance, the amount stipulated in Annex A, which can be found at page 145. And hopefully, Chair, this is a bit of a clearer copy to the one that you had yesterday.
At what page?
Page 145.
Yeah, it's much better.
Just for the record then, Mr. Piri, you're at page 145.
Yeah.
There appears to be a series of subsidies. The first relates to a concession. The second relates to route marketing. And the last relates to operations costs. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
And these subsidies are in relation to the two airports, one being Pilanesberg and the other one being Mafeking.
That's correct, Chair.
Please explain to the Chair what operations costs, sorry, let's start from the top, what a concession as an airline subsidy could possibly mean or relate to.
Chair, the airline subsidy would relate to costs that would have ordinarily be incurred by S Express in extending its services to the two airports, Pilanesberg and the Mafeking airport. And those costs would be subsidized accordingly. So it's being referred to as an airline subsidy.
Okay. And then the next category of costs is called the route marketing subsidy. What is your understanding of the route marketing subsidy?
The marketing subsidy, Chair, would be making reference to the cost to the airline in developing the route. As I previously said, that in the case of Dubai Tradeport, it was the 3 months period before the commencement of the first flight. But obviously, in this regard, they are talking about the route development in its entirety, that even post the launch of the first flight.
So just to amplify on what you said, under the Dubai Tradeport, you spoke.
I'm sorry, just 1 second. Thank you.
To amplify or clarify what you've said, under the Dubai Tradeport, it was contemplated that you're looking at about a 3-month period before the launch of the first flight that you would need to invest for purposes of marketing that particular new route. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
But in this particular instance, there's a subsidy which is granted over a 5-year period.
That's correct, Chair.
How long does it normally take then to have a new route fully functional and fully operational as part of ordinary routes?
As I indicated, I mean, the preliminary marketing costs would mean that the cost that you have incurred in marketing a flight before its first flight. But the assumption again is that in a period of a year or two, that you may be making losses on the route before you start making money. So route development could actually extend to a year, within which you turn around a route to be profitable. But certainly, it cannot be for a period of 5 years. Generally, in the aviation industry, 1 year would be enough to ensure that the route is profitable.
And then if one were to look at the actual route marketing subsidy, that was allocated to Pilansberg and to Mafeking, respectively. In year one, it was an approximate amount of 14.6 to 14.8 million. In year two, it was 4.8 million. In year three, it was 4.5 million. In year four, it was 4.5 million. And in year five was also 4.5 million. Do you have any comments to the costings, or rather to the subsidies that have been granted over this 5-year period in relation to route marketing in particular?
Say from the comment that I've already made, Chair, that ordinarily in the aviation industry, 1 year should be enough to develop a route to a profitable situation. I do believe that, firstly, extending for 5 years is, I would call an outlier. It's not common in the industry. But secondly, the quantum in year one just looks a bit excessive to develop a route in year one.
Okay.
You
If we
didn't
could,
say earlier on in your evidence that when an airline starts a new route or starts on a route that it hasn't been, or starts a new route, I think you said, that the first 2 years it wouldn't make profit. You didn't say that.
There's documentary evidence, Chair, and also there would be documentary evidence stating in the industry for a regional carrier how much it would actually spend to develop a route. But of course, I mean, that's subject to confidentiality because that information cannot just be shared with the public. I think our competitors will be quite excited to get that information.
Yeah,
So,
no. I don't necessarily want that information. I just want to check whether I might have misunderstood your evidence. I thought earlier on, much earlier, I thought you had said that if an airline starts a new route,
yeah.
the first 2 or so years, it should not expect profit. So I'm just checking whether that's not what you said earlier.
Chair, I was stating that generally, if you are starting a new route, it should take you a year or 2 to turn it around into a profitable situation. But for a typical regional carrier, we aim for a year. But I was just talking about in generality, it can take you 1 to 2 years to turn it around.
Oh, okay.
But in the case of regional carriers, we basically plan for a year.
Okay.
the last category of costs is termed operations costs. And for each of the 2 routes, an amount is allocated to each of those routes at 11 million for each of years 1 to 5. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, how does operation costs compare to the concessions that is referred to above in this table?
Chair, I think this is where I was a bit confused because the Annex A, the way it's broken down, what they call a subsidy and the concession, it doesn't particularly tie to the way the agreement was actually structured. That's one. But secondly, it seems to me that there's a duplication because if you look at the 3rd row where it says concession airline subsidy, my impression was that it would have covered what they call operations costs. So it seems to me that there was some sort of indulgence and a repetition, which is worrying, just looking at the agreement in the context of this Annex A and the way they've broken down the subsidies. 1, it looks excessive, but 2, it seems as if there's a duplication of what they define as a subsidy or a rebate.
Yeah, okay.
In your experience, how would these costs compare to the average cost of operating a CRJ 200 aircraft, 50-seater?
Chair, whilst I can't comment on a specific aircraft type, because as I said, that almost like is privileged information, but I can talk in general terms.
Yeah.
If you if an airline is operating a regional jet, an appropriate regional jet for Johannesburg to Mafeking or to Pilanesberg, it should cost in the region of 50 to 60,000 per trip.
How many thousands?
50,000 to 60,000
Okay, per trip.
per trip.
Yes.
Now, if we extend that to 3 flights a week for the entire year, it comes to close to between 12 and 14 million total cost. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you had to cast it for 3 frequencies a week,
Yes.
and operating either to Pilanesberg or to Mabato from Johannesburg, it tends to double if
Okay.
you're looking at the Cape Town to Pilanesberg. It would typically possibly be about between 22 million or 25 million per annum. That's the total cost of operating the aircraft type suitable for Pilanesberg and Mafeking.
Just to excuse my ignorance, what exactly is a frequency?
I think he said 3 times a week.
Frequency is the return leg. So what I've done is the cost of operating a trip, and the trip is the
A return trip.
yeah, it's a
A
return
return trip. 3 times a week, you said, or not? A return trip 3 times a week, or?
Yeah, it's a return trip.
Yeah.
3 times a week.
Yeah.
That would cost to about the 11 to 14. But that also, I mean, the 14 would basically talk to 4 frequencies. So 11 million, we are talking about 3 frequencies. 14 million, you'll be talking to about the 14 frequencies. So that would be basically the range that the approximately that the would be incurring as an airline.
And those costs that you're talking about in general, you're talking about what it would cost today as opposed to that time. What are you having in mind? Are you having in mind some time back or at the moment?
We are talking about at the time, at the time when the operation was active. So
Okay.
it's not at today's rates chair.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the numbers that you've given are really operations costs. Is that right?
Yeah, the operational cost, which includes the list of expenses that I've spoken about, which is the cost of the aircraft, which if you own it, then it's depreciation. If you lease it, it's the lease costs, the cost of the crew, both pilots and the cabin crew, the cost of fueling the aircraft, the cost of providing meals to the passengers, and all other costs which I would comfortably bundle them and the handling charges, which also includes accelerated charges as well as ATN. So it's the cost of operating to and from the relevant airports.
And the costings that you've given then, would that include ground handling costs?
That's correct.
Now, if you were to look at this table again, it's subdivided into 2 levels. The first relates to the airline, the second relates to the management company. Effectively, on the average costing that you've given, which ranges between 12 to possibly even early 20 million per annum, the management company subsidy is aggregated to 11 million over the 5-year period, whilst the concession applying to the airline, which is SA Express in this instance, ranges between 11 million to 34 million over the full period. Is that right?
That's correct.
So effectively, the subsidy that has been provided here, would you say that it would be a partial rebate to the incurring of costs, or could it amount to more?
Chair, as I said, that the amounts seem to be quite excessive from my experience and from my knowledge in the industry. In this case, I can categorically state that these amounts were basically overstated.
Can I then ask you to turn to page 16 of the bundle? And having considered then the 4 ground handling agreements, the first being commonly referred to as the PUMCO agreement, concluded with Pilanesberg Airport Management Company. The second being with MUMCO, being the Mafeking Airport Management Company. The third being Valotech Facilities Management CC, and the Coronega Event Manager, or rather the agreement concluded with Coronega Event Manager, trading as Coronega Trading and Projects. You've considered all of these 4 ground handling agreements, is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Chair, just for the record, these agreements appear from annexures 8.1 to 8.4 of the bundle. This table represents your consolidated analysis of the services that were contracted from each of the service providers, is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
And in particular, the services that you've identified which were contracted by each of them, following the correction that you've made, was airport management, passenger handling, ramp handling / aircraft handling, and route development or marketing. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
Thanks to your assistance to the Commission, you have also provided an agreement between SAA and SA Express in relation to passenger handling at the King Shaka International Airport. Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
And that particular agreement appears at tab 9 from page 263. Whilst certain agreements between ourselves and SAA have resulted in redactions to annexures to this agreement, based on your personal knowledge, is it correct that the rates that are charged, in particular to passenger handling at the different airports, are charged at rates per different types of aircraft?
That's correct, Chair.
And so there is a clear table, although that particular detail is not placed before the Commission due to reductions, but there's a clear table that is incorporated in respect of each airport under the annexures to this agreement, which clearly identifies set costs as opposed to a globular amount.
That's correct, Chair.
Thanks to your assistance as well, if I could ask you to turn to page 17. You've also provided us with, rather you've provided the Commission with the standard ground handling agreement concluded between SA Express and Menzies Aviation.
That's correct, Chair.
That particular agreement appears from page 307 of the bundle. If I could ask you quickly to turn to page 312. sorry. Sorry, it's 309. My number's confused. You've provided this particular agreement to look at the basis of rates payable specific to ramp handling. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so as appears on page 309, once again, you have ramp handling costs, which are rated according to particular types of aircraft.
That's correct, Chair.
Is it therefore correct that in terms of the two agreements, additional agreements that you've provided, the one being the ground handling concluded between SAA and SA Express, the other one being between SA Express and Menzies, that the very basis for claiming is a rate that is clearly defined, specific to a type of aircraft?
That's correct, Chair.
How does this pricing formula compare to the ground handling agreements as you've dealt with in the table, which appears on page 16, such being the MAMCO, PAMCO, Coronega, and Valotec?
Chair, before I respond to the question, if you could just indulge me for a second, because I just want to explain the context of the SAA contract versus Menzies.
Yes.
I would like to go back to the issue about the services, just to allay the confusion. Passenger handling at the King Shaka International Airport had been subcontracted to SAA. So we don't do our own handling in Durban, at least at that point in time. But secondly, we had to also contract with Menzies on what we call the airside or on-ramp, on-ramp services. But what I must emphasize, just in terms of the rates, is that the AXA identifies licensed service providers from which any airline can opt to contract with. And in the case of S Express, like another SOC, you go through an open tender process. So although you are confined to the licensing service providers, but you are obliged as per process to go out on a confined tender, and of course you evaluate the bids or the proposals on the basis of certain criteria, one of which is basically the rates. So when we look at awarding such services, it's basically done on a competitive basis, although it's confined to those that have been licensed by AXA. So my point is that the rates that you see in here are fair rates based on a process that we had to follow. So in response to the question that the evidence leader has posed, in terms of these rates compared to the Northwest, it's actually quite difficult to compare from the point of view that I don't think any process had been followed. These service providers were just appointed, possibly without following an RFP process. So we would never know whether they were fair or not fair. But again, if I just look at the rates in the context of the subsidies, they seem to be quite odd and excessive.
Thank you. If I can now ask you to please turn to page 19 of the bundle. Because in as much as you compare the Dubai Trade Port suite of agreements with the Northwest suite of agreements, You've amplified certain aspects to the claim and payment methodologies specific to passenger handling on the SA Express ground handling agreement, ramp handling agreement in relation to the SA Express and the Menzies agreement. And what you also then do is that you now deal with marketing spend of SA Express generally. If you could keep your finger on this particular page and open to page 145, which is the annexure to the main agreement that details the different subsidies. So at page 19, so keep page 19 open, but also keep page 145 open. So at page 19, you detail then the marketing spend of SA Express as it's recorded in the management accounts, which just for the record is attached as Annexure 11, Chair, that appears from page 349. Can I ask you to just place on record the annual marketing spend for the financial years of 2014-2015?
The market spend, Chair, for 2014-2015, and the financial years basically run from 1st of April to end of March. S Express had spent 1.9 million. In the following year, 15-16, it had spent 1.03, and in 16-17, it had spent 7.4, and in 17-18, 7.9 or 8 million.
Is it correct that the financials for SA Express has in fact been audited, signed off, but not yet released?
For
For the
which year?
financial years of 2018-2019?
For the financial year 18-19, yes, they've been signed off by the auditor, but they're not in public domain yet. They have to go through the process through our shareholder and then the cabinet. So I would want to think that for the purpose of the testimony, those should be set aside from the point of view that these 18-19 financials are not in the public domain, Chair.
Why is there such a big difference between 2015 and 2016 on the one hand and 2017 and 2018 on the other hand?
Chair, I've missed you there.
Sorry?
I couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay. Why is there such a big difference on 2015 on what was spent in 2015 and 2016 on the one hand, and on what was spent in 2017 and 2018?
Chair, I'm not sure what actually happened.
But can you see what I see?
But there is actually definitely a spike for the 2 years.
Yes, because
there was definitely a spike.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, Chair, what could have happened. That
Yes.
there's an additional 6 million in each of those
I mean,
years.
2015 and 2016 are 1 comma something.
Yeah.
And, well, 2015 is almost 2 million, it was 1.9. 2016 is 1.03 million. But then 2017 is 7.4. And 2018 is 7.9. It's difficult to think it could be inflation related.
No, because I mean, Chair, the increase is, I think, quite a huge spike.
Yes,
so there's
yes,
no way it can be
yes.
inflation. But falling short of having to give that level of detail,
Yes.
I'm just surmising that
Yes.
it's during which Northwest
Yeah.
project happened.
Yes.
So it could have been, but I'm just supposing.
Yeah.
I would need to check whether that's indeed correct.
Yeah.
There's an additional 6 million in each of them.
Yes.
It's almost like a spike that is
Yes.
unique to the 2 years.
Yes.
So I'm just suspecting that there could be an activity that
Yes.
happened in those 2 years. And I'm just
Yes.
assuming that it could have been something to do with the Northwest, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, and then 2018, 2019, there is that 534 there, that's because it's incomplete. It doesn't reach a million yet, because that's an incomplete year or what?
Sorry, Chair?
2018, 2019,
Yes.
you have got 534,000. Is that right?
That's correct, and that's the,
And that's because that's not final, that's not
that's
the
correct.
final figure.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, no, that's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This market spend, does it relate to existing routes or does it include new routes as well?
Chair, if I take you back to paragraph 70.1, financial year 14-15, where an amount of nearly 2 million was spent in marketing. During that year, S-Express had introduced 3 additional routes, namely Johannesburg-Pietermaritzburg, Johannesburg-Kruger National Park in Mpumalanga, and the Cape Town Kimberley. So that 1.9 or near 2 million does include route development of these 3 routes. And the reason why I'm mentioning it specifically is I'm trying to put a context to the reasonableness of route development of the 2 Northwest airports or
Yeah.
routes.
Thank you.
And on your reasonableness point, can we then turn to page 145
145.
while keeping your fingers still at page 19? The spend for the financial year 2014-2015 was 1.9 million.
Yeah.
And that included existing and 3 additional routes.
That's correct, Chair.
As compared to the route marketing subsidy for the 2 new routes, which for in year 1 totaled approximately 28 million, year 2, 9 million, year 3, 4, and 5, also 9 million. One last point then, and that is in relation to the new route that SA Express launched during December of 2018. Can you please provide the Chair with an overview as to without necessarily having to mention any detail, because the price sensitivities have been redacted and doesn't form part of this commission. But can you just give a brief overview to the Chair in relation to the market spend on the new route launched during December 2018 as compared to the costings of these subsidies as well?
In December, Chair, we had introduced a Johannesburg-Umtata route in the Eastern Cape Province. And we spent in the region of 100,000 in terms of marketing and developing that route. And that route is actually performing quite well, just in 6 months. And it's one of the routes that we believe that we will be able to turn it around or get it to a profitable level within the 12 months that I was making reference to. That we spent hardly 100,000 in marketing and developing the route. And again, I think that should be done in the context of the excessiveness or the reasonableness of the amounts of money that are being spent on the route development as far as Pietermaritzburg and the Mafeking airports are concerned.
Thank you.
Chair, before I close, in all fairness to this witness, he wasn't provided with a copy of Annexure 1 to the Coronega Agreement, which has been presented as part of Mr. Ngwenia's evidence yesterday. But he has just briefly looked at it this morning. On that particular annexure, having looked at it quite briefly this morning, does it change your position in relation to the costings on the ground handling agreements?
No, Chair, it actually doesn't. I think it just puts to rest to the testimony that was delivered yesterday, that the main agreement had stipulated exactly the issues that he need to qualify for rebates, or what they call concessions. And the subsequent agreement does have that annexure, which I had a copy of until this morning, that basically looks at the service and the rates, which don't talk to the subsidies that are captured in the main agreement, because those amounts are quite insignificant compared to the millions that have been defined as the rebates in the main agreement. So my position still remains that
Yes.
the rebates and the concessions or subsidies
Yes.
are quite excessive
Yes.
with the Northwest Province project.
Thank you.
Then just to summarize some of the observations that you've given through your evidence on the Northwest agreements. As compared to the clear parameters of claim entitlements and payment processes reconciled under the Dube Trade Port suite of agreements, is it correct that the Northwest suite of agreements, which comprises of your main agreements and then the 4 ground handling agreements, which were effective at some or other stage, dealt with advancing a subsidy to SA Express? Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
And that particular subsidy related to a subsidy provided to SA Express and also to the management company, whichever it may have been at any particular point in time.
That's correct.
And the management company's subsidy was split between route marketing and operating costs.
That's correct.
And in particular, as compared to the arrear payment methodology under the Dube Trade Port Agreement, this particular subsidy was paid in advance before any work would have taken place, likely within that particular financial year.
That's correct.
What are your concluding observations when looking at the Dube Trade Port contract structure and management as compared to the Northwest contracts, the Northwest suite of agreements, contract structure and management?
Chair, I can look at the 2 projects from 3 eyes. The first eye is the way the contracts had been structured. Chair, sometimes some of us have got the third eye.
No, I'm laughing about 3 eyes.
So the first eye, it's the way the contracting was done. If I may go back to the relationship between S Express and the Dube Trade Port, who were the 2 main contractors, vis-a-vis AXA and the third-party service providers. The relationship there is actually quite clearly defined. As an airline, because we make use of an airport, would have no choice but to contract with the AXA to provide the infrastructure. But secondly, we're also saying that the AXA, as an airport manager, has the obligation to ensure that the service providers that provide this ground handling are selected in accordance with the IATA and the ICAO standards. So they go through a very rigorous process to ensure that those that have been selected and licensed are compliant to IATA and the ICAO standards. And as an airline, the way we select our preferred service provider is through an open tender process, which we did, and as a result, we had to contract with the SAA and the contract with Menzies for the purpose of the King Shaka Airport. So the contract that we are sitting with the, this particular project was between S Express and the Dubai Trade Port. And of course, the service provider would have to be contracted in accordance with the own PFMA processes. Now, in terms of Northwest, I'm looking at it through the first eye, is that there was a contract between Northwest and the S Express. But on the back of it, S Express then had to contract with these ground handling service providers. My understanding, my knowledge is that no procurement process was actually followed, one. But also, secondly, there is no sense that these ground handling companies are IATA or ICAO compliant. I mean, that test was actually not done. So that's the first eye. The second eye talks to the incentives. The agreement between S Express and the Dubai Trade Port was typically an arm's length negotiation with the clear objectives having stated by Dubai Trade Port, and also the clear objectives that were stated by SACS. And in that regard, the terms of reference for the relationship were also clearly defined, and one of which was the use of incentives to encourage S Express to operate out of Durban. But those incentives were clearly defined as the rebates. And again, there was a full definition of what those rebates mean and how they should be paid. So it was very clear in the agreements and what we were paying for. The third eye, which I believe is actually quite important, is now the mechanism of claiming those incentives. Was that with the Dubai Trade Port agreement, it was very clear that it would be done in arrears, and the Dubai Trade Port would have to verify whether the costs are legitimate and the quantum is reasonable through the invoices, and then checking it against either the gazetted tariffs or the contract that we have had with the SAA and the Menzies as the ground handlers. And that bit was basically lacking in the Northwest, in the sense that not only was the reasonableness in terms of quantum done, but also it is stated that the S Express was going to be paid in advance, and there was no accountability for the funds that were paid to S Express.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. There's no further questions from our side.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Piri. If you are required to come back, we'll ask you. And if anybody applies for leave to cross-examine you and that application is granted, we'll ask you to come back. But unless you have a question that you didn't think about earlier, I'm about to release him.
There's no further questions
Okay, all right.
from our side.
Thank you very much, Mr. Piri. You are excused. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Chair, with your leave, I've been requested to ask that you please warn Ms. Patudi, who was summoned to be here today, for appearance tomorrow.
Yeah, where is Mr. Patudi? Oh, Miss Patudi.
Yes, Ms. Patudi.
Okay. Please be back here tomorrow. We are going to aim to start at 12 tomorrow. There might be a little bit of some delay because some things will be beyond our control, but be here by 12 o'clock. We are going to adjourn then for today, and tomorrow we'll aim to start at 12. There might be some delay, and if need be, we may go on until early evening if we have to, in order to make up for the hours that we won't be able to use tomorrow morning. We adjourn.